Hi guys, we're back, and we need to discuss some problems that are going to lead to open warfare between the United States and Great Britain. Now, I've already mentioned in several previous lectures that under first George Washington and then also under John Adams, our second president, that there was some tensions between the United States and not only France, but also Great Britain. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that both the British and the French were stopping American ships, seizing illegally the cargo on board and not paying for it, and in some cases illegally seizing sailors. This is a practice that is known as impressment of sailors. And this problem had only continued to grow, actually, by the time our third president took office, that being Thomas Jefferson. All right, so Jefferson as well is also struggling with, lots of people saying, why don't we stand up for ourselves? Let's fight the British already. Come on, we stood up to the French. But Jefferson, like his predecessors in office, also understood that the United States was still laboring under enormous debts that they had racked up during the Revolutionary War, that the United States was still barely had a fledgling navy, much less a tiny little army, and so it just wasn't in the cards. And so for that reason, we're going to see Jefferson pushing Congress to enact the Embargo Act in 1807. He's trying to do anything non-military, anything short of triggering open war with Britain, to try and stand up for American shipping neutrality. What this act did, though, was it prohibited virtually all exports of U.S. goods abroad and imports of foreign goods to the United States. This ended up being really pretty deadgum disastrous for the American economy, and Britain barely noticed it. They had plenty of other countries that they were trading with during this period. So Jefferson badly miscalculated. He thought that the British needed American trade so much that by cutting off American trade through the Embargo Act, that it would force them to respect American shipping rights. That didn't work. Instead, what we see is with ocean traffic halted in ports across the country, about 30,000 sailors lost their jobs. Also, American farmers, unable to ship their crops abroad overseas for sale, had to sit there and watch their hard work that year rot on the docks. So farmers are going into debt as a result of this. It basically destroyed America's economy during this period. It's not any surprise, therefore, that you've got some people smuggling goods through a black market economy, selling to the British anyway, quietly, through British Canada to the north. And so what we see is Jefferson, to enforce the embargo, took steps that actually went against some of his campaign promises about respecting individual liberties and keeping the powers of the central government in check. For example, he mobilized the Army and Navy to enforce the blockade, and even declared the Lake Champlain region of New York State along the Canadian border in a state of insurrection. All right, so pressure to abandon the embargo mounted early in 1809, just 3 days before Thomas Jefferson left office for his second term of office. Congress finally repealed the Embargo Act. Upset by the failure of his policies, the then 65-year-old Thomas Jefferson looked forward to his retirement with the following words, quote, "Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power." The problem of defending American rights on the high seas now fell to a fellow Virginian, the fourth president of the United States, James Madison, who, while a rather shy and kind of quiet, retiring figure, had a definite political asset in his wife, Dolly Madison, who was just excellent at hosting parties, at making people feel at ease, both Americans and foreign diplomats, and then of course later on getting snack cakes named after her. But not to minimize her role, Dolly Madison really was kind of the first lady that was very good for public relations, shall we say, for the White House and the presidency there. Now, when we talk about the relationship between Britain and the United States, it will turn sour when the United States, through various means, begins trading with France. After the cancellation of the Embargo Act, several other legislative measures will put into effect, and France finally will agree to respect American shipping neutrality. So we will start to trade with France, who is still at war with Britain, and Britain will take this as an insult. We also are beginning beginning to see a newer generation of American leaders in Congress who were starting to call more loudly for war with Britain. These are individuals that never lived through the humiliation of the American Revolution, where the Continental Army just got its rear end kicked over and over again. A few victories here and there. But this younger generation of kind of war hawks, as they became known, those that were campaigning for war against Britain, they're starting to agitate ever more loudly in Congress. And a lot of that has to do with rumors that the British were agitating Native American tribes on the frontier. Now, when we look at the career of Tecumseh, he was a Shawnee leader who, among many in his generation, were tired of dealing with the Americans who continued to move west and deprive them of their land, continued to show a blatant disregard for the culture and traditions of Native American peoples. So Tecumseh actually began along the western frontier. He, along with his brother Tenskwatawa, sort of initiated kind of a Indian religious revival, telling people, do not sell to the whites any longer. Do not use their manufactured goods. Swear off of their alcohol. Instead, turn inwards and let's put our differences aside as tribal peoples. Let's stop fighting one another, so that we can now unite to fight off the much greater threat, which is that of white Americans. Ultimately, Tenskwatawa, Tecumseh's brother, will be killed in late summer of 1811 in the Indiana Territory at a town called Tippecanoe. And when the American commander there, William Henry Harrison, who will later go on to become president, when he's looking over, the battlefield at the end of this conflict, he is disturbed to see British-made guns that the Indians had been using in this affair. So with that knowledge now sent back to Congress that the British were in fact equipping Native American peoples along the frontiers, with weapons and perhaps encouraging them to fight the Americans, we see that this newer generation of war hawks will have their say in Congress. And what we see is by June of 1812, President Madison gave in to the pressure and finally declared open war with Britain. So this is how the War of 1812 begins. The United States once more was woefully underprepared to fight the British. The Army consisted, for example, of fewer than 7,000 soldiers. The U.S. Navy, just about 6 warships. In contrast, Britain had nearly 400 warships and an army that numbered in the tens of thousands, a seasoned army that had seen action. So once more, you just almost have to shake your head and go, gosh, this is virtually suicidal. But yet, it took place. Now, surprisingly, while the U.S. still had a very small navy, its merchant fleet were able to kind of hold their own against the British along the East Coast, despite the fact that the British, as you can see on the map that I have here for you, they will create a blockade along the East Coast and will basically jam up a number of these very important port cities like Philadelphia or Charleston or New York to try and starve out the Americans, to make sure that they weren't trading with other powers where they could get reinforcements of guns, ammunition, or other things to keep up the fight. For the Americans, their early strategy was targeting British Canada to the north. Many people were strangely optimistic that this would get the job done. Even Thomas Jefferson believed that victory over the British in Canada, he said, was nothing more than, quote, a mere matter of marching. That he believed, wrongly, but that if the U.S. could get its troops up to Canada, we could very quickly vanquish the British. That is not what happened. Over and over again, you're going to end up seeing the British will have the help of many Native American tribes serving as scouts and spies. They will be able to alert the British forces so that they can prepare for the Americans coming. And it's just going to be a number of losses, especially along the northern frontier with Canada. In the southern territories, we'll see that General Andrew Jackson, will have some successes against the Creek Nation at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He ultimately will defeat the Creek Nation and force them to relinquish about 20 million acres of land to the United States. What we're going to see, though, is, again, with the British, they were kind of stretched thin. They were also fighting the French at the start of the War of 1812, so their forces were kind of divided. However, by by 1814, they have defeated the French, and now the British can turn the full force of their military to North America. In August of 1814, they landed a force in the Chesapeake Bay and began marching towards Washington, D.C., catching the city almost unawares. The British then set fire to many public buildings in the nation's capital, including the president's home. They marched north, also attacking Baltimore, and they began rallying forces to invade the port city of New Orleans. At the Battle of New Orleans, though, in late 1814, early 1815, against, again, seemingly all odds, General Andrew Jackson will put together a ragtag army, including French pirates, Choctaw Indians, Western militiamen, freed slaves, will all join in the American effort to defend the port city of New Orleans. And so this will be a very real victory in the war, the Battle of New Orleans, in which the Americans will defeat the British soundly. However, this battle concluded after peace negotiations had already started between both sides. Remember, it takes several months to get information at this point in time from one part of the Atlantic over to North America. So, yeah, technically the Americans' greatest victory happened after peace negotiations had already begun between both sides. What's interesting, too, is the Hartford Convention, a group of Federalists who will start meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. And these are individuals who've been out of power for a number of years. If you'll think about it, we hadn't had a Federalist president now for some time, not since our second president, John Adams. And so you end up having a group of sort of disenchanted Federalist politicians upset over the war. Some, not all, but some Federalists tended to sympathize with Britain in the war. And what a few of them will manage to do is bring up the S word, meaning secession. A few of the delegates at the Hartford Convention actually trotted out the idea that perhaps New England, that the Northeast should break away from the rest of the United States and instead join back with Britain. They were in a minority, though, to be fair, but once word got out about the Hartford Convention, especially after the Battle of New Orleans, this great American victory, Americans started turning on the Federalist Party. Many of them considered them traitors. How dare you be talking about joining the British during this war? You can't be trusted. So essentially, the Hartford Convention will spell the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party, which will never recover from the bad press that they receive. And then, in a bigger sense, I want you to understand some of the effects of the War of 1812. I mentioned it a few minutes ago. With the Creek Nation, for example, losing to General Jackson, they will be forced to give up large amounts of territory. Tecumseh will pass away at the Battle of the Thames at the hands of U.S. forces in 1814. So the budding alliance between many of these western tribes that Tecumseh was putting together, all that falls apart when he is killed during this conflict. And so what we're going to see is, again, the nation continuing to steadily move westward, now taking over even more territory from Native American tribal peoples. The U.S. will not necessarily win this war, but they'll manage to outlast the British again. So you're not going to see, the United States picking up any new territory from the British. Essentially, both sides just kind of call it quits. We're tired of fighting. You go your way, we'll go ours. But despite this, the U.S. is now considered a military might. Spain, for example, will agree to cede the Florida territory to the United States for a price. They have to get paid, but in 1819. Through the Adams-Honest Treaty. So, in other words, the United States has fought the British, one of the largest and best trained militaries in the world. Not once, but twice. And so this garners the United States a certain measure of international respect, if you will, among other colonial powers. Also, I mentioned in the previous slide, the Federalist Party, now it is political suicide to run as a Federalist for any political office, because people are going to say, you guys are traitors, you were talking about seceding from the nation. Again, even though that was only a tiny portion of the party. And so this is going to initiate a period of one-party rule in the United States, where only one party, the Democratic Republican Party, they will be the only party fielding candidates for the next decade or so. And then finally, the wartime hardships forced Americans to begin the process of industrializing their nation and also building transportation infrastructure like roads and bridges to get people and troops and goods from one area to another as quickly as possible.